Hi, everybody, and welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by SeedWorld Group. My name is Marc Zienkiewicz, and I'm an editor with SeedWorld Group. And this month, we're talking with people from across the industry about science communication and how we as an industry can better educate the public about science. Today, we're talking with three experts to try and answer an important question. Are vaccines helping bolster public support for biotechnology? I'm joined today by Kevin Folta, a professor and biotech educator based in Florida. Welcome, Kevin. Ron DePaw is science advisor for CCAN, which is Canada's largest supplier of certified seed. Welcome, Ron. And last but not least, Stuart Smythe is a professor and agri-food innovation expert at the University of Saskatchewan. Welcome, everybody. Now, before we talk about the use of biotechnology and the COVID vaccine, I wanted to highlight how biotechnology has been used in modern medicine for a long time. This is nothing new. It didn't just come about recently. Ron, I talked with you a while back about the COVID vaccine issue, and you mentioned that mRNA vaccines, specifically the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, use the same technology that's being applied in many areas of our lives in medicine and plant breeding. Your background using new technologies in plant breeding goes back decades, as you've been one of Canada's most well-known plant breeders. You also have a huge interest in biotechnology itself and medicine. Can you give us a brief synopsis of the use of biotechnology in medicine and then its use in plant breeding today?
Yes, to start, I'll share a little bit of history on the use of biotechnology to make um, uh, medical products such as insulin. In 1978, the first human insulin was prepared using recombinant DNA technology. Now, the recombinant DNA is a technology that was used to insert a human gene with the DNA coding to make insulin into the genetic material of a common bacterium, E. coli. The recombinant GMO bacterium, E. coli, could now produce the protein encoded by the human gene for insulin. These recombinant GMO bacteria were placed in large fermentation tanks. There, the recombinant bacteria use the human gene to produce human insulin. The insulin is harvested and purified from the bacteria, which is the insulin for use as a medicine for people. This GMO insulin has been used safely for about 44 years. And there are many examples of our beneficial medicines that are the products of biotechnology.
Wow,
Now,
so medicine like this has been going on for a long time. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about the COVID vaccine, biotechnology, and this just, began recently, last year when the COVID-19 pandemic began. But I mean, this is something that obviously goes way, way back.
right. So now to say a few things then about these mRNA vaccines. And mRNA means the messenger RNA. The messenger tells the ribosomes in the cell how to make a specific protein or a part of a protein. So these mRNA vaccines teach our cells how to make a protein that triggers an immune response inside our bodies. The benefit of these mRNA vaccines, like all vaccines, is those vaccinated, the people who get vaccinated, gain protection without ever having to risk the serious consequences of getting sick with the COVID-19 vaccine. So the mRNA does not affect or interact with our DNA in any way. The mRNA never enters the nucleus of the cell, which is where our DNA, our genetic material, is kept. The ribosome in the cell breaks down the RNA and gets rid of it soon after it's finished with the instructions. And these new mRNA vaccines were made possible by the collaboration among scientists internationally. Incredibly, they sequenced the SARS-2 COVID-19 virus within a few months, and they learned how the virus infects the human cell. They then developed a de-arming response, which is the basis of these various vaccines. It's really incredible. So the basic biology is used in plant and animal science. And over the past years, technology has been developed to sequence the genome of an organism, understand its gene function, and learn how to make changes in the DNA coding to make a new product. And I'm going to give you an example, a Canadian example. A new type of apple has been developed which doesn't brown when cut into slices, and it's called the Arctic apple. And it is based on using a technology known as RNA interference. It turns off a specific gene. The gene that was shut off or silenced in the Arctic apple is a polyphenol oxidase. It's an enzyme that participates in the oxidation process that causes browning of apples that everybody is familiar with. The technology used to silence this gene did not introduce any foreign DNA. The gene silenced is the apple's own gene. And it's a Canadian invention by Dr. Neil Carter and his team from the Okanagan. Fascinating.
That is fascinating. It's really neat to think of plants and the human body as being very similar, that we can use the same technology to help and actually improve both. Now, Stuart, I have to credit you with actually inspiring this episode of Seed Speaks. I interviewed you a while back, and you mentioned that you thought the COVID vaccine was helping the discussion about biotechnology in the public realm, as these vaccines are developed using biotechnology, obviously. Now, your career as an educator, Stuart, is intricately linked to biotechnology. Why do you think the COVID vaccine discussion might be helpful in maybe bolstering people's opinion of biotechnology?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept, Mark. Is one of the things that I really heard a lot through the summer and fall of 2020, and even into the first few months of 2021, was the vaccines have been developed and commercialized by biotechnology companies, and the mainstream media was very prominent in informing society about the role that biotechnology firms played in the development of the vaccines, and then the safety of them being approved by regulatory agencies around the world. And so I'm hopeful that if the public and everybody as individuals is willing to line up and get as Ron was saying, an mRNA vaccine injected into their arms, it'll reassure them about the safety of biotechnology. And so when they see food products that have been developed through either genetic modification or more recently now through genome editing, they'll be reassured that these products are as safe as the vaccines that they've been willing to receive.
Now, Kevin, you're a very well-known science educator. You just finished a piece comparing public hesitancy around genetically engineered crops to COVID vaccines. Now, obviously, this is something you have a huge interest in. What have you found, and why is that important? Can you talk a little bit about that, Kevin? I think you might still be on mute. There we go.
Oh, there we go, unmuted. Both times, both examples are cases where the public doesn't necessarily know who to trust. They're suspicious of federal governments, of regulators, and of the scientists who are providing the good information about what these technologies are. And that's what they really share. Unfortunately, it tends to have them drown out the experts, who are the people who should be giving them the best information. And instead, they turn to social media, where bad information runs wild and actually spends a lot of time misinforming people and their opinions, which has an effect on public health. And then it gets one worse. There actually is an industry that has emerged to denigrate the science of genetic engineering, as whether it applies to vaccines or to crops. And these folks are making a lot of money by misinforming people through social media and eroding trust, which is causing problems in their acceptance of good technology in food and now in a pandemic.
Yeah, like I'm really intrigued by this topic because, as we know, millions of people around the globe have lined up to get the COVID shot, knowing very well that these vaccines are made in a laboratory using biotechnology. I don't think anybody has any illusion about these vaccines being a so-called natural product. I mean, we all know that they're made in laboratories, and yet many of those same people who got the COVID vaccine are maybe not as likely to be so positive about genetically engineered food, for example. Like, I know people myself who happily got vaccinated for COVID, but if you ask them whether they're comfortable with genetically modified food, a lot of them aren't sure. They say, well, the jury's still out on that, and I don't know if I agree with GMOs, et cetera, et cetera. Why is that? Why might someone be happy to line up for these vaccines, but yet not be comfortable with the idea of genetically modified food, for example? Like, why is that? And what do you guys think we need to do as an industry to change that?
Well, for myself, I think it is important to distinguish between cisgenic and transgenic. And cisgenic means a genetic modification of a gene from within the same crossable, sexually compatible grouping. For example, transferring a gene from goat grass into wheat, such as the gene called LR21 that confers resistance to leaf rust pathogen. This gene is widely deployed in Canadian and American wheat varieties. Transgenic means introduction of some DNA from a non-crossable, sexually compatible grouping. For example, the introduction of DNA to code for human insulin inserted into the DNA of a bacterium, of the E. coli. So these are two very, very different examples, and types, cisgenic versus transgenic. And I think we have to help people to understand what these differences really are.
Yes, Stuart and Kevin, what do you think? Like, it's obviously, the science is very complex, as Ron just pointed out, and the average person may not understand some of these things, but obviously it's key to help them to understand that there is a difference between these things, and you can't lump everything into the same boat, and so how do we facilitate that public understanding? How do you go about trying to crack that nut, so to speak?
One of the things I think that's important in this is mainstream media's contributed to the certainly the public's unwillingness to be sure who to trust or about the safety or efficacy of GM foods, largely because they've contributed to promoting that message. And we see this with the anti-vax movement and the COVID vaccines as well, that mainstream media has certainly given a voice over the last 20 years to the anti-vax movement. And so I think they're starting to realize that they're part of the problem. And so, by communicating more about the role of biotechnology and the safety and efficacy of drugs, that I'm hopeful that they'll understand that as a responsible broadcaster, if they're trusting the science behind vaccine efficacy, then it's the same science that goes into producing modified or innovative food products, and they'll be somewhat hypocritical if they continue to support COVID vaccines and still campaign against genetically modified or genome edited food products.
Yeah, I can give you my thoughts on that too. The problem is that when you're talking about food, you're talking about a different emotional connection than when you're talking about medicine. That our reaction to food is very emotionally driven. You say someone's tampering with your food, or the messaging that's been there from the anti-GMO movement. Someone's putting something into your food that you don't want there. People are very skeptical of that and treat that with a lot of concern. On the other hand, medicine, as was mentioned earlier, like insulin, tends to be appealing to a different part of the brain. It's not emotional. It tends to be a little bit more a little bit more cognitive, a little bit more executive function to sort out what it really means. In the case of the COVID vaccine, the folks who have been working against our messaging have relied on the messaging of fear to add that emotional overlay to this discussion on vaccines. And that's had catastrophic effects. We know that 50% of people remain unvaccinated, yet we have this tremendous tool to fight a pandemic. What that means is that we need to be countering these messages in specific ways. We can't just give people more evidence and tell them about mRNA and ribosomes. What we have to tell them about is why it's important to protect the vulnerable, to protect small business, to protect our healthcare workers and our healthcare system. We have to explain that these are the things that are important, not necessarily, and that by receiving the vaccine, we contribute to all of these important national ideals. These are the ways that we'll solve the problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Kevin, because like you say, some people have chosen not to get vaccinated, and quite often that's their reason, is that they're suspicious of biotechnology. They don't trust the technology itself, the same technology that's used in GMOs. Well, if it's also used in these vaccines, and I don't like that, so I don't want this in my body. I don't want to get vaccinated. And so while there are people who have gotten vaccinated who maybe are not comfortable with biotechnology and its use in food, there's other people who will say that that's the reason I'm not getting it, is because I don't trust biotechnology at all. And so it really becomes this bigger issue of how do we get people to realize how beneficial this technology is for them and those around them. And in some ways, I guess that can be a much taller order, I suppose, Kevin?
Well, it could be, but this is the beauty of this, is all you have to talk about is the sterling examples, how people are their lives are being saved through biotechnology. The mRNA vaccine is the first innovation on a new type of technology that will solve everything from specific cancers to other types of complicated ailments that previously have remained untreated. And that brings a message of hope, that when people start to see the unsolvable being solved, that Victoria Gray, throw that one out there. She's the first person who has been cured of sickle cell disease, a disease that affects about 100,000 North Americans, mostly African Americans, African Canadians, I guess you'd say, but folks in North America who suffer from this debilitating disease. And it's going to be solved by biotechnology. We're going to win this discussion by talking about how important it is to solve real health problems for people using this amazing technology. That's how we win it.
Now, I'd like to ask all three of you for a personal recollection. If you each have an example recently where you've seen the publicity around these vaccines, maybe making somebody rethink their views on biotechnology, and how that was a lesson for you in how we can better communicate this topic as an industry. I'll start with you, Stuart. Have you had a personal experience recently where you've talked to someone who, maybe all the publicity around these vaccines has made them rethink the use of biotechnology or something like that?
I guess the one area, and this ties back to a comment Kevin made earlier about the role of some specific organizations that have made it a business plan to disseminate misinformation and disinformation. And one of the interesting things was that in July, the Philippines government approved the commercialization of golden rice. So it's rolling out, it's going to enter their food system. It's going to improve the ability of human body to source vitamin A. And so one of the things I've been doing is promoting this as a real success for the biotech sector, but also highlighting how Greenpeace has worked for 20 years to try and make sure that golden rice never came to the market, and really starting to question their ethical principles on this. And I've had some people through social media reach out to me and say, I agree with you. I don't believe that Greenpeace is an ethical organization anymore. Who do you suggest that I could donate money to that supports environmental improvements in environmental sustainability other than Greenpeace? So I think that's a good sign that the public are starting to question the messages put out by some of these environmental activist organizations that simply don't respect the mountain of evidence of safety and social benefits.
And how about you, Ron? Have you had an experience recently that's given you some hope that this whole biotechnology discussion we're having as a society is maybe taking a positive turn?
Yes, I think, and it comes back to thinking about the medicines that we are quite willing to take, um, and it starts then with having the conversation that there are medicines that are the products of recombinant DNA biotechnology, and people will take it. And and I agree very much with Kevin there, that there's a different approach to taking a medicine as opposed to taking food. And the other thing that I've been doing and having is that to try to following in the social media about the anti-vaxxers, what they're thinking, and to try and understand that particular point of view, so that when I have a conversation with somebody then about the use of biotechnology products, whether it be in medicine or in food, is to have a better understanding of where they're coming from. And it really is, some of their points of view are really, really takes a lot of thinking to try and get at, understand what it is that, where they're coming from. It's a big challenge for me to really understand and appreciate where they're coming from.
Yeah, that's really key for me as well, is to try to look through someone's eyes and see why they think what they think. It's amazing how we as human beings, what we base our opinions on. You bring politics into it and all sorts of different things. And it's really quite fascinating how we as human beings form our views of the world. But like you say, Ron, it's really key to understand why somebody thinks the way they do. And Kevin, how about you? Have you had an experience recently that has given you hope that maybe these vaccines are helping people to really want to understand biotechnology better?
Yeah, almost every day. And it's fantastic because I'm getting active in social media. I go on to Facebook. I go on to our county's page where they talk about vaccination, and I engage the people who push back against it. And I don't sit there and tell them about mRNA. I don't tell them the number of nucleotides in the spike protein, but I do tell them about the importance of protecting local business, making sure that the people in the hospitality industry remain employed, that the vulnerable people who are on chemotherapy, the children who can't be vaccinated, the people who are immune compromised, how it's our role as a society to protect them. And there have been many times throughout the history of our nations where we've all been asked to make sacrifices for the national good. And they've been really extreme. People have gone to wars for this stuff, rationed, you name it, to mitigate a national threat. This is much less by comparison. And all we're asking people to do is roll up their sleeve in a new kinds of arms race, right? A new call to arms, if you will. So the idea here is to get people to realize that this is nothing freaky and unusual. And you find that when you just basically talk about the values and why it's important, not how it works or why or what it does, but why it's important, you find that you can start to get buy-in. And it's a slow process, but you have to engage. And even if you don't change one person's mind, the internet is a spectator sport and other people are watching.
Before I let you guys go for the day, before we sign off, I just want to poll each of you, yes or no answer. I want to make sure we accomplished our goal here today. Are vaccines helping bolster public support for biotechnology? Ron, yes or no? What do you think? Yes,
Yes.
from Ron.
Yes.
How about you, Stuart?
Yeah, I think the average citizen is hearing a more positive media response, and even as Kesman says on social media, that things are changing slowly. So we're slowly getting there. I would say that in the past 12 to 15 months, the average individual has heard a more positive message about biotech.
And Kevin, how about you?
When the guy at Starbucks is talking about mRNA and PCR, we're making progress. This is the way to make this kind of eerie sounding science to be something familiar and something that people want more of rather than be afraid of.
Yeah,
I agree.
I'd also like to add that I think that there is a greater awareness that by participating in getting vaccinated, we are contributing to the common good that Kevin has been speaking about. I think it's raising awareness about our role contributing to the common good.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. So I will say yes to thumbs up, just like Ron. Thank you so much for your time today, gentlemen. That's all the time we have today. Join us again next week when Alex Martin will tackle the topic of GMOs and organic ag, the history behind the controversy, and how it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. She'll host Rob Fraley, former Chief Biotechnology Officer for Monsanto, John Entine, Executive Director of the Genetic Literacy Project, and Mac Earhart, President of the Albert Lee Seed Company, as her panel of experts. So make sure to tune in for that. Kevin, Ron, and Stuart, thank you again for this great discussion. And thank you to our audience for spending your lunch hour with us. This is Marc Zienkiewicz of Seed World Group signing off.